Hello, my name is Malika Jabber, and for the purposes of today's demonstration, I will be conducting a walkthrough example of employment impact accounting. And this is ultimately to help better illustrate impact accounting and how we apply and calculate the framework at each of the various steps, as well as how those adjustments ultimately marry together to provide us with a total employment impact figure. Now, before I dive into the nitty-gritty, I wanted to provide a high-level overview of impact accounting. So high-level, impact accounting is a way to measure and report a company's performance in terms of its both positive and negative impact. Those impacts are to both its employees and the neighboring community. If we take a look here, we see I provided us with the formula, again, high-level formula, for total employment impact. When we start to go through these steps, you'll notice dollar figures, and that's because employment impact uses a method called monetization, which essentially assigns a dollar value to all of the various dimensions. And again, you'll hear me reference dimensions, some of which are listed here. And that's because employment impact is calculated across various dimensions or impact dimensions. Now, the starting point in calculating total employment impact, as referenced here in the formula, is to determine the total wages. That's going to be for the entire accounting year and for all employees paid. You then subtract the wage quality, diversity, and opportunity adjustments. And finally, you add the local job creation adjustment. Now, for the purposes of today's demonstration, I've conducted a created a base case of employee X. I've also made the relevant reference demographics. And before I dive into those demographics, it's important to note that for the purposes of the demonstration, I've tried my best to make these numbers as digestible as possible. But it is important to note that in real-world application, it's very rare that these numbers are going to be as pretty or nice, I should say. But nonetheless, the math itself and the steps to calculate the figures remain the same. So we see here employee X. The year in reference is 2022 at state Z with company ABC. Job category for employee X is a scientist, and she is a Black female earning $90,000 a year. The average salary at her firm for that role is $92,000. Employee count at company ABC is 100, and the living wage at state Z is $75,000. The regional living wage is $80,000, however. The local LE, or local satiation point, is at 112,500. The regional LE, again, that satiation point, on a regional level, however, is at 120,000. The LE adjusted salary is at 115,200. And the marginal utility rate is 1.28. Finally, the living wage category for employee X is 100% or empowered. We know that because employee X is earning a is earning a salary of $90,000, which is above the living wage rate of $75,000 for state Z. I know I just mentioned a few terms that might not be familiar. I'll dive deeper into them, but before I move on, I did want to touch on income satiation. So I know I mentioned the local LE, regional LE, and LE adjusted salary. When we're referring to income, we know, or I should say economists know, that income is very closely associated with happiness. So when I reference the satiation point, that's essentially the point by which 1 unit increase in salary or wages is no longer going to have an adverse effect or unit increase in happiness that same way. So for state Z, that point, that satiation point, where no matter how much more money you earn, you're not going to continue to receive unit increase of happiness, is at 112,500. It's important that we distinguish the satiation point from the living wage. You'll see here employee X is earning above the living wage, but she's still earning below the local satiation point. The living wage, when we're talking about that, it's more in terms of the minimum salary to cover an individual's basic costs and needs, meanwhile maintaining a reasonable quality of life. The satiation point, however, is the point where they're fulfilled and that salary is more comfortable, if you will, given the location that they reside. Now to the first step, as I previously mentioned in calculating total employment impact. Our first step is to sum total wages. For company ABC, the sum of total wages in the accounting year paid to all employees was $10 million. The next step is to subtract wage quality impact. When we're talking about wage quality, we're essentially assessing whether employees are being compensated at a level that meets living wage standards. When we're talking about wage quality, however, mathematically, it is comprised of 3 individual adjustments: living wage adjustment, income satiation adjustment, and wage equity adjustment. The sum of those 3 adjustments equals the total wage quality impact. Now to the first step of calculating wage quality, the living wage adjustment. The living wage adjustment ultimately the living wage adjustment ultimately assesses whether wages are being paid that meet the living wage benchmark. We do this to ensure that employees can meet their basic needs based on the income that they're receiving. So the first step in calculating living wage adjustments is to determine the living wage category for each employee. We do this by taking the actual wage for employee X, that's $90,000, and dividing that by the living wage. In state Z, we know that's $75,000. We then multiply that figure by 100%. In this example, because employee X is earning above the living wage, the figure we reach is above 100%. So we'd consider employee X empowered and within that 100% plus category. Now that we've calculated or determined the living wage category, our next step is to calculate the living wage adjustments per category. To calculate that, we take the number of employees in each living wage category. We'll do this for this step for the 100% living wage category, because that's the living wage category that employee X falls under. We then multiply that by 1 minus the living wage rate, in this example, again, that 100%, and we multiply that by the living wage. For state Z, we know that's $75,000. We do this for all of the employees. For employee X, again, because she is earning above a living wage, this adjustment is essentially going to zero out. However, that might not necessarily be true, and likely is not true for all other employees within the firm. We then would take this step and continue that step for each employee in the firm, and the sum of all of those values is where we ultimately calculate the total living wage adjustment. So we take the sum of all of those adjustments for all employees within the firm, and we multiply that by -1. In today's example, we reached a figure of -$50,000. Now that we've calculated the living wage adjustment, we can now move on to the income satiation adjustment. Like I mentioned, income satiation is associated with happiness, and essentially, if you're earning enough, if you will, to in terms of salary. When we're looking at the income satiation adjustment, however, we're taking that concept in mind, but we're calculating to determine who is earning in excess of that living wage, the income satiation point. So essentially determining how many employees are earning above that point and how much is that figure. So the first step is to determine the local satiation point. I've already done that previously and I had it listed in the reference demographics, but for reference, I was able to reach that figure by taking the local living wage, that's $75,000, and dividing it by the regional living wage, that $80,000. I then multiplied the regional LE, or satiation point, of $120,000. I was able to reach a figure of $112,500. That $112,500 is going to be the local satiation point, and essentially the point that we're testing to see, are employees earning above or below that $112,500? Which brings us to the next step of the income satiation adjustment. We test. So we take each employee's salary and we compare it to that $112,500, and we determine if that employee is earning below or above. For employee X, although she's earning above a living wage, that's $75,000, we can see here that she's still earning below that local satiation point salary or of $112,500. Because of this, her adjustment here would zero out. However, we can complete this step for every employee in the firm. And once again, although for employee X it zeroed out, that might not necessarily be true. It's easy to imagine that many employees within the firm are going to be earning above a salary of $112,500. In those cases where an employee is above that satiation point, the step here is to then take the difference between those two values, the difference between the LE adjusted, and we subtract that by their actual wages to take that difference in figure. Once we've done that for all of the employees, we sum all of the income satiation adjustment values. In this instance, we reach a figure of negative $500,000. Now that we've calculated the income satiation adjustment, our next step and final step in calculating wage quality is to calculate the wage equity adjustment. When we're talking about wage equity, the purpose of this adjustment ultimately is to ensure that wages are equitable within various job types and seniority levels, and that's to ensure that equal pay is earned for equal work. So the first step is to calculate the wage difference. We do this by taking the average wage of each demographic group. For employee X, that's Black females, and we subtract that by the average wage of the highest paid demographic. For employee X, we noted that the individuals with her in her category, the average wage for those individuals were $92,000. We subtract that by the average wage for the highest paid demographic within that job category. So again, employee X, if you remember, is a scientist. For this instance, it's $110,000. And we take the difference of those two figures and we reach a number of negative $18,000. Now that we've calculated the wage difference, we can then calculate the equity adjustment. So we take that wage difference we've just calculated, that negative $18,000. We then multiply that by the number of employees in the demographic group. In this instance, we noted that there were 2 employees in that same demographic group. We take that negative $18,000, we multiply it by 2, and we ultimately reach a figure of negative $36,000. That's going to be our equity adjustment. We then repeat this process for each demographic group, and ultimately we sum all of those wage equity adjustment values. In this instance, we reached a figure of negative $500,000. Now, the true final step of calculating wage quality is to sum those 3 adjustments we've just calculated. So we take that negative $50,000 for the living wage adjustment, we add that to the negative $500,000 for the income satiation adjustment, and the negative $500,000 for the wage equity adjustment. Once we've summed those, we reach a total calculation for wage quality impact of negative $1,050,000. Our next step is to calculate the diversity impact. When we're talking about diversity, we're essentially assessing the demographic makeup of the firm, and it's important to note that we assess it and compare that demographic makeup to the demographic makeup of the local population. That's important because, say in state Z, there are 10% white females. We would then expect in this firm, ABC, that there is also 10% white females. This helps to ensure that reasonable standards are being set for the firm and that they have access to acquiring that set level or percentage for each demographic group. So again, it's important to note that when we're talking about diversity, it is tied to the locality. So these ranges are going to differ based on where the firm is located. Now, the first step in calculating diversity is to calculate the representation gap. We reach this by taking the percentage makeup of any given demographic group. For employee X, that's Black females, and we subtract that by the percentage makeup of that same demographic group, but within the local population. So we can see here that at company ABC, there's 5% Black females. We also see that in the local population of state ABC, there are 7% Black females. So we would take the difference of those two to determine if there's a disparity. We see here that the 5 in the firm is 2% less than the 7% representation in state ABC. Pardon me, in state Z. And because of that, we reach a calculation of a negative 2%. Again, that negative 2% represents the representation gap. Now that we've calculated that negative 2%, we can calculate the workforce gap, which essentially turns that percentage into a whole number. We take that representation gap, that negative 2%, and we multiply it by the number of employees within the firm. We know at company ABC, there are 100 employees at the firm. We then reach a figure of negative 2. Our final step is to determine the diversity debit. So you take the workforce gap we just calculated, that negative 2, and you multiply it by the average annual salary, in this instance, $92,000. We then reach a figure of negative $184,000. And you do this for the entire firm and all demographic groups. And ultimately, and you sum all of those figures up. Ultimately, we reached a figure of negative $2 million. Our next step is to subtract the opportunity impact. When we're talking about opportunity, we're essentially assessing the demographic makeup of the firm, but within the various job categories and seniority levels of the firm. So recall earlier I mentioned, let's say state Z has 10% white females. And then I said for diversity, we'd like to see that there's 10% white females within the firm. Well, now that we know, regardless of if they do or don't, we'd also like to see that at each job category and seniority level, there's also 10% white females. That's to ensure that the diversity of the firm of any given demographic group is dispersed evenly within those various job categories and seniority levels. Much like the wage equity impact, or wage quality, pardon me, adjustment, opportunity is comprised of two separate adjustments: the opportunity across job categories and the opportunity across seniorities. Now, the sum of those two adjustments equal the total opportunity impact. The first step in calculating opportunity across job categories. Again, we're assessing the diversity within various job categories within the firm. So the first step is to calculate the expected number of employees. We're able to reach this figure by taking a look at the workforce demographics, so the percentage representation for that demographic group within the firm. In this instance, employee X, we know that there's 5% Black females within the firm. We then multiply that by the number of employees in the high salary group. In this instance, there are 20 employees in the high salary group at company ABC. Once we run that calculation, we reach a figure of 1. That 1 means we expect to see 1 employee within that high salary group. So let's cross-reference what's expected to what's actually happening at the firm. The next step is to calculate the opportunity gap in the high salary group. So we take the actual representation. Unfortunately, for company ABC, there are 0 employees, Black females specifically, in that high salary group. And we subtract that to the expected representation that we just calculated, that 1. The difference of those two gives us a figure of negative 1. Now that we have the opportunity gap, our next step is to calculate the opportunity penalty. In order to calculate the opportunity penalty, we take the average high salary group's salary and we subtract that by the average low salary group's salary. So we take the $110,000 that we referenced earlier and we subtract it by what in this case was the low salary group's average salary, $60,000. The difference of those two figures is $50,000, and that represents the opportunity penalty. Next, we calculate the opportunity across job categories adjustments. We take the opportunity gap that we previously calculated, that negative 1, and we multiply that by the $50,000, the opportunity penalty. In this instance, we reach a figure of negative $50,000. We repeat this step for all of the demographic groups within the firm. And once again, we sum the total of all of those adjustment values. For the case example today, when we did that step, we reached a figure of negative $400,000. Now that we've calculated the opportunity across job categories, we can then calculate the opportunity across seniorities. So you'll see that this follows a similar scheme, except at this instance, we're taking a look at seniority levels as opposed to job categories. For the opportunity across seniorities, the first step is to calculate the expected employees per seniority and job category. So again, we take a look at the workforce demographic makeup, that 5% of Black females, and we multiply that by the number of employees in the seniority level and job category. In this instance, there are 40 employees. We then would, because of that, when we run the calculation, we then would expect that there are 2 employees per seniority and job category for this specific given demographic group of employee X. The next step is to calculate the opportunity gap. So we're going to compare the expected that we just calculated with what's actually happening within the firm. We see here that there is actually 2 employees within that demographic group in the seniority level and job category. So we take the actual representation of 2, subtract that by the expected representation we just calculated 2, which brings us to a figure of 0. Again, this figure, much like in other instances, might not always zero out. And that's important to note for other demographic groups. However, for employee X, it happened to zero out. The next step is to calculate the opportunity penalty. We're able to reach this calculation by taking the average salary in seniority level N and subtracting that by the average salary in seniority level N-1. For the purposes of today's demonstration, we could use seniority levels 3 and 4. So employee X, the average salary in seniority level 4 is $100,000. You subtract that by the average salary in seniority level 3 of $95,000, and we reach a figure of $5,000. The next step is to calculate the opportunity across seniorities adjustment. So we take that opportunity gap, again in this example, although it was 0, that might not necessarily be true for other employees. But we take that opportunity gap we previously calculated, that 0, and we multiply that by the opportunity penalty, in this instance, that $5,000. We then reach the opportunity penalty. And we continue that for all of the various seniorities and job categories within different demographic groups. Once we've done that for all of the various demographic groups, seniority levels, and job categories, we finally sum all of those values. In today's instance, we see that the sum of all adjustment values totals a negative $100,000. The final step in calculating opportunity impact is to then sum these 2 adjustments. So we take the negative $400,000, the opportunity across job categories adjustment, and we add that to the negative $100,000 opportunity across seniorities adjustment, bringing us to a total opportunity impact of negative $500,000. And finally, we add job creation. When we're talking about job creation, we're essentially determining the positive impact that this firm has on the local labor community based on the jobs that it's created. The first step is to determine the incremental wages that were received due to the firm's employment. You take the average salary in location 1. For the purposes of today's example, there is only 1 location for company ABC. So we take the average salary in location 1, in this instance, $75,000. We then subtract that by the maximum annual social safety net through unemployment insurance. For state Z, that happened to be $25,000. The difference of those 2 figures is the incremental wages received to firm employment. In this instance, $50,000. Now that we have the incremental wages, we can then calculate the hypothesized unemployment rate without job creation from the firm. To reach that calculation, you take the total unemployed people at state Z. In this instance, state Z has 5,000 unemployed individuals, and you add that by the total employees at the firm. For for company ABC, that's 100 employees. You then divide that by the total number of employed people in that state. in this instance, 50,000, and you add that by the total unemployed people, that 5,000 we referenced earlier. Then you divide those two figures, and we reach an ultimate calculation of 9%. So that 9% represents the hypothesized unemployment rate that we would have, or state Z would have, if company ABC had never hired anybody. Our final step is to calculate the monetized job impact. So we take the incremental wages received due to the firm's employment that we just previously calculated in the first step, that $50,000, and we multiply that by the hypothesized unemployment rate we just calculated, that 9%. We then multiply that by the number of total employees at the firm. For company ABC, that's 100 employees. Once we run the calculations for those figures, we reach a value of $450,000. And again, because I said there's only one location, that's going to be the total job creation impact for company ABC. In other instances, when firms have multiple locations, you would repeat this process for each location and then sum all of those values to reach the total job creation impact. Now that we've calculated all of the individual adjustments, we reach our final steps, the total employment impact. So you see here the formula I referenced earlier. Total employment impact equals total wages minus wage quality, diversity, opportunity, plus local job creation. So we're going to plug in all of the numbers we've just previously calculated. The total wages we knew at the beginning was $10 million. We subtract that $10 million by the wage quality, diversity, and opportunity, that $1,050,000, $2 million, and $500,000 respectively. And finally, we add the local job creation impact that we just calculated of $450,000. Ultimately, we reach a figure, once we run those calculations, of $6.9 million. That $6.9 million represents the total employment impact for the firm as a whole. But because we're looking at the firm as a whole, it's not necessarily a scalable or comparable figure. This company might have 1,000 employees, which might throw these calculations off. So in order to make these figures comparable for all companies, regardless of size, we need to scale these, and that's where we recalculate the employment impact intensity. Think of this as a per capita figure. So we take that 6.9 million, that total employment impact, and we divide that by the total number of employees at the firm. In this instance, that 100 employees. You then reach $69,000. That, again, is representative of a per capita figure, or we could think of it as $69,000 per employee in terms of employment impact intensity. Now that we have that figure, we can compare across the industry, across competitors, and we have a figure that is more contextual in terms of scalability and how we can apply it and track and measure change within the firm, within the industry. Thank you.